Om Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swamine Tapaharini. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our ongoing class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Today we're discussing what I consider to be one of the most powerful sutras in the entire text. When I first read the book, I read the book in Swami Vivekananda's translation when I was in grad school a long time ago, like 20 years ago or something. 20 years ago? Yeah, a little bit like that. Yeah, almost. And the book is amazing. How many of you have read Raja Yoga? Yeah. It doesn't read at all like a dry scholarly treatise. There's like a real power in his words. And some of his commentaries on some of these sutras are just like really amazing. And they were really powerful for me when I was just before I'd become a monk. And I was like, it just gave me this strength and a kind of insight and clarity, which I'm really grateful for. And one of those commentaries is the one on this sutra, which I think is very penetrating. So what I'll do this time is actually read Swami Vivekananda's commentary on this sutra, 2.15, before we go into Bryant's, which is also extremely helpful and long. It's like almost 10 pages, just his commentary on the one sutra. So we might even spend the entire class just discussing this sutra. But it's an extremely important sutra. And we'll see why in a second. But a heads up first. Our next class is Thursday, July 24th, so exactly 2 weeks from now at 7:30 p.m. And assuming that we cover both 15 and 16 of Book 2 today, those two sutras, then the assignment would be to read Sutras 17 through 19 of Book 2, so 2.17 to 19, and read Bryant's accompanying commentary, pages 213 to 222 of Edwin Bryant's The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, as always. Okay, so let's plunge in. Could you please repeat after me? It's a long sutra, so I'm going to break it up. Parinama. Come on, guys. Parinama. Tapa. Samskara. Dukkha. Guna. Vritti. Virodhat. Cha. Dukkham eva. Sarvam. Vivekinaha. Very good. Okay, now, I'll begin by reading, let me read Swamiji's translation, and then we'll go into Brian. So, okay, this is Swami Vivekananda's translation of 2.15. To the discriminating, the word viveki is used, vivekinaha. That's somebody with viveka. His name is Vivekananda, so viveka. To the discriminating, all is, as it were, painful. Okay. Dukkha. The word dukkha, well, it's not up here, but anyway, it's a word commonly used in Indian spiritual traditions. You'll find it in Buddhism, you'll find it in Sankhya, you'll find it in Vedanta, you'll find it in the Gita. The Gita describes this world cheerily as dukkhalayam ashashvatam. It's an abode of dukkham, of sorrow, suffering. Actually, we'll talk briefly. It's in Brian's commentary. What's the best way to translate the term dukkham? It's an interesting question. Typically, it's translated as suffering, but there are also alternative terms that may be better. And I think that part of the beauty of the term is that it has multiple shades of meaning. And that's why sometimes it's better to leave things untranslated. So we'll talk about some of the different connotations of the word dukkham. Where was I going? I was in the middle of saying something that I don't remember. No, I went on one tangent and then, okay, anyway, we'll come back to this. Okay, so
So here is Swamiji. To the discriminating, all is, as it were, painful, on account of everything bringing pain either as consequence. So one thing that I'm just bringing to your attention is, instead of translating dukkham as sorrow or sorrowful, he translated it as painful, okay? Okay, so now, notice how he's going to be translating. There are 4 key terms, okay? This sutra is explaining, in a nutshell, why everything across the board is dukkham. Everything without exception. It's one thing to say that, the effect of tornadoes and floods is dukkham. When your partner dumps you, dukkham. When your toe gets stepped on, dukkham. But another thing to say, when you get into your, top choice of college, when you get that dream job, how is that dukkham? What in the world? When you meet when you get married to somebody you love, how is that dukkham? And so on and so forth. But literally everything without exception is dukkham. That's the bold statement that's being made here. And the sutra gives 4 reasons why literally everything ultimately is suffering. I like the term kind of unfulfilling better. Unfulfilling isn't all that it's cracked up to be, things like that. 4 reasons. First one, the term used in the sutra is Parinama. This literally means consequence. So what are some of the examples I gave? You get into that dream school you've been dying to go to for your whole life, and then you get in, you get that acceptance letter, and you're on cloud 9, you're jumping up and down, but then what happens? You got to come down from that cloud eventually. And you might find once you go to that dream college, it's not all that you were hoping that it would be. Maybe the students there are competitive to the point of being insane, and they have no life, and they're not fun to be around, and they make you anxious. And then you're like, wait a minute, I spent my whole life trying to get in this school, and now I'm miserable. This is one example. So even if at the moment you feel some kind of pleasure or happiness, eventually it's going to issue in sorrow. That's why in chapter 18 of the Gita, I think it's 18, if not 17, but I think it's 18. It's 18. 3 kinds of happiness. Sukham, opposite of dukkham, sukham, the Sanskrit term sukham. And Krishna distinguishes these 3 kinds of sukham, happiness or joy, based on the 3 gunas, which we'll talk about later in the class. Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And the structure of all Rajasika happiness, all Rajasika forms of joy, is that in the beginning it's like nectar. Amazing, I love it. In the end it becomes like poison. Visham. So that's exactly what this parinama means. Even if you're happy now, the happiness is ultimately going to issue in sorrow in the end. Okay, that's first. Number 1 reason why everything across the board is unfulfilling. Number 2, this is where I think Swamiji is really beautifully original. He's not following the mainstream understanding of the term. The term is Tapa, okay, T-A-P-A. Tapa means literally being scorched, burned. We all know the feeling. And it's being scorched by suffering, okay? And so the mainstream interpretation that goes all the way back to the first commentator on the Yoga Sutras, namely Vyasa, is that it just means suffering. So it's the opposite of getting your dream job or getting your dream partner or whatever. It's not getting that job that you were dying to get. It's you lose a loved one and you're plunged into misery. So, that's obviously suffering, right? That's kind of Vyasa's explanation. We'll see in more detail how Vyasa interprets it. But it just means all those experiences of suffering and negativity that all of us go through at some point in our lives, right? Swamiji, by contrast, of course he accepts that there are things that are inherently negative in a certain sense, but his rendering of the term is, I think, really brilliant. He says, anticipation of loss of happiness. Anticipation of loss of happiness. I wrote it on the board. I think you all probably know this feeling. Even in the midst of those like peak happiness experiences, in the midst of it, there's a kind of shadow over the whole experience because you know it's not going to last. There's something tragic about it. The happiness itself has this like seed of despair in it. It's like, if only this could last, but I know it won't. And then that starts to eat away at you. And of course, you're right. And because you've been through the experience so many times, you know you're right. You desperately want it not to be true, but you know in your heart of hearts it is true. So I think this is captured in what Swamiji is saying here, anticipation of loss of happiness. In the midst of happiness, you're already anticipating a loss of the happiness, which is a source of unhappiness. Okay. Third reason why everything is unfulfilling. The term is samskara. This is a term which it's come up a lot in the previous sutras. So people who have been following the class or know something about Indian philosophy, you'll know what it means. A samskara is a latent mental impression. Everything we do, say, even think, produces or leaves behind a latent mental impression. It carves out a kind of trace in the unconscious. So what? Why does that matter? Well, in the future, when there's a certain kind of trigger for that samskara, like let's say I eat like a tiramisu, and the eating of it is pleasurable, but it's also generating samskaras, latent mental impressions, of the pleasure I'm getting from eating the tiramisu. Now fast forward a couple of weeks, and right on my table is this amazing looking tiramisu. What happens? That samskara I had from 2 weeks ago, that got created 2 weeks ago when I ate that tiramisu, gets reactivated. And it creates a fresh craving, an even stronger craving for that tiramisu. My mouth starts watering. And then imagine that some cruel person says, too bad, I'm going to eat it. What happens? I'm miserable. But you might say, well, what if they don't do that? Well, who would be so cruel? What if they brought it for you to eat? And you eat it. Isn't that great? Well, yeah, great. But the problem is, there are a few things here. In economics, there's the law of diminishing returns. And we all know this too from experience. The first time we have something or experience something pleasurable, it's the best thing in the world. And then, of course, what you want to do is, let me do it again. Every subsequent time you do it, it's not quite as good. And because it's not quite as good, you need more, like a greater quantity of it, or somehow it needs to be more sensationally that thing, qualitatively greater in some way, for you to get the same kick out of it, the same dopamine burst that you got the first time around. And you end up chasing these fleeting, shadows. You're never fulfilled that way. We're going to get to the details of that later as well. Okay, so samskaras are kind of independent but also a profound source of our suffering. Every time we experience pleasure, that creates a samskara, a latent mental impression in our unconscious, which will get re-triggered. It's just waiting there to get re-triggered. And the moment it does, it produces a fresh craving, which makes us unhappy, right? Because we want something we don't have. There's a kind of inner emptiness that we're trying to fill with, and we convince ourselves that this thing, if we get this thing, we'll be whole again. And we might feel that wholeness for a split second, but then again we feel that emptiness, and then the cycle goes on. That's the third reason. Oh, and the way that Swami Vivekananda translates this suffering resulting from some samskaras is fresh craving arising from impressions of happiness. Okay, so that's just a really nice summary of exactly what I just said. And finally, the fourth reason, also as what he says, counteraction of qualities. This sounds very technical, but it just requires a little background in the three gunas. Okay. The Sanskrit phrase is guna vritti virodha. And there is a slight... So Swamiji differs from Bryant primarily on the second reason, tapa. And he differs from most of the commentators as far as I'm aware. I really like Swamiji's interpretation. And it doesn't conflict with the other interpretation. He accepts that, but then he adds something, I think, new and insightful. to the meaning of tapa. With regard to this fourth reason, counteraction of qualities, it's more or less what Bryant is saying, but I'll just read you Bryant's language to explain guna vritti virodha. It's a little bit more literal. He says, the suffering ensuing from the turmoil of the vrittis due to the gunas. The turmoil of the vrittis, the mental modifications or fluctuations, due to the three gunas. Okay, so what are these three gunas and what's the connection between these gunas and the vrittis? The gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. I prefer the translation energies for these gunas rather than qualities, which is the typical translation. So these are the three energies. Okay, and sattva is the energy of clarity, calm, peace, light, and it manifests as qualities like unselfishness, compassion, goodness, being spiritually inclined, a lot of good stuff, being content. That's a really important quality of sattva. Finding your joy within rather than looking to the external world for your fulfillment, and so on. And then rajas, the energy of rajas. This manifests as things like desire, worldly desires, cravings, ambitions, strong attachments, emotional attachments. Emotional neediness is one of the main manifestations of rajas. So depending for your happiness on other people or other things outside of you. Okay. Lust, anger, these are all also stem from rajas. And then the third one, tamas, the lowest of them all, it literally means darkness. And it manifests as lethargy, depression, cruelty, having a very cynical, negative outlook on life, on other people, being critical of everyone, and so on and so forth. So these are the three. Now, the crucial thing here is, according to Indian spiritual traditions like Sankhya and Yoga and Vedanta, nobody is 100% sattvic or 100% rajasic or 100% tamasic. But in most of us, one of these three gunas predominates. Okay, there's a kind of preponderance of one guna, typically. Or it might be, and I think this is actually more true in a way, you have to get more nuanced and you have to be more fine-grained. In the course of the day, I think each of us will find we can be extremely sattvic in one area of life, in one sphere of life, in one particular activity, in one particular interaction that we might have, and be extremely rajasic in another area of our life and extremely tamasic in another. It might be that it's hard for us to get out of bed and we sleep 12 hours a day. That's kind of tamasic. But then raising our children, for instance, if we have kids, very sattvic. We're not helicopter parents, that would be more rajasic. So it could be that one guna dominates in each area of your life. That's also possible. But if you just look at your kind of overall personality and your overall qualities, typically what the scriptures say is that one of these tends to dominate over the other two. Nonetheless, there's always an intermixture of these three. And there's always they're unstable. The interaction of these three gunas is unstable. You do something that is not in alignment with sattva, and then like you go to some kind of, I don't know what, like a nightclub or something, and then that'll increase the amount of rajas, and then I'll throw off your sattva, and it'll increase the amount of rajas, and so on. There's always this danger of, even if you're very sattvic in a particular state on a particular day, there's always a danger that that's going to plunge down, and then the other gunas are going to rear their ugly head, and so on and so forth. So that's more or less what this fourth reason for everything being suffering is about. The turmoil of the vrittis, the mental fluctuations due to the gunas. And so even if we have this really amazing meditation, which is very sattvic, right? If you're very concentrated, you're deriving great joy from the meditation. Often there will be something. It might be that it's some kind of noise or something. I've started wearing AirPods recently when I meditate with just noise canceling, not music, because I find that even little noises, especially when we have a 101 highway right next to us, right next to the temple, but even little noises can distract me. But there are these little, but that's true of anybody, and even at much deeper levels of meditation, people can still get distracted by different things, and then that turmoil of vrittis will come up again. Okay. All right. So now let me read to you Swami Vivekananda's commentary. It's about 1 page, and then we'll go into Bryant. So Swamiji says, the yogis say that the man who has discriminating powers, the viveki, the man of good sense, sees through all that are called pleasure and pain, sukham and dukkham, and knows that they come to all, and that one follows and melts into the other. He sees that men follow an ignis fatuus all their lives, a false hope, and never succeed in fulfilling their desires. The great king Yudhishthira once said that the most wonderful thing in life is that every moment we see people dying around us, and yet we think we shall never die. Surrounded by fools on every side, we think we are the only exceptions, the only learned men. Surrounded by all sorts of experiences of fickleness, we think our love is the only lasting love. How can that be? Even love is selfish. And the yogi says that in the end we shall find that even the love of husbands and wives and children and friends slowly decays. Decadence seizes everything in this life. It is only when everything, even love, fails, that with a flash, man finds out how vain, how dreamlike is this world. Then he catches a glimpse of vairagya, renunciation, catches a glimpse of the beyond. It is only by giving up this world that the other comes, never through holding on to this one. Never yet was there a great soul who had not to reject sense pleasures and enjoyments to acquire his greatness. The cause of misery is the clash between the different forces of nature, one dragging one way and another dragging another, rendering permanent happiness impossible. Okay, so that's the commentary. Very powerful. He emphasizes at the very end, the fourth reason, as far as I can tell, this different forces of nature, the 3 gunas, dragging in different directions, making happiness impossible. But he also, in the translation, explains in more detail the other reasons why everything is suffering. Bryant, I think, does a really nice job of drawing on traditional commentaries and some modern scholarship to really flesh out the meaning of these 4 terms in the sutra, and also makes it very kind of contemporarily relevant for us, I think. So now let me read to you Bryant's translation, and then we'll start looking at his commentary. And one of the nice things he does is he compares this sutra to the teachings of Buddhism, and that's why I've written out a kind of comparison of the 4 Noble Truths of Buddhism with what I call, of course this is not like a thing, but the 4 Noble Truths of Yoga. I just decided to have fun for the sake of the parallel. Okay, so now here's Bryant's translation. For one who has discrimination, everything is suffering on account of the suffering produced by the consequences of action. So that's Parinama. By pain itself, Tapa. By the Samskaras, the latent mental impressions. And then 4, as well as on account of the suffering ensuing from the turmoil of the vrittis due to the gunas. Okay, so this is the beginning of his commentary. We won't read the whole thing, but we'll read quite a bit of it, I hope. Patanjali here, this is page 204 of Bryant. Patanjali here makes a seemingly radical statement that everything is seen as dukkha, suffering, by the wise. In the previous sutra, so this is going back to the discussion from our previous class, he noted that pious activities produce hlada, pleasure, H-L-A-D-A. But lest anyone take this to indicate that the pursuit of pleasure through piety be a fitting goal of life, he here informs us that even the so-called pleasure of prakriti is only deemed pleasure relative to more obvious forms of paritapa, pain. To the vivekan, one who has viveka, discrimination, all is suffering. Even the so-called hlada, pleasure, of good birth, experiences, and lifespan mentioned in the last sutra, jati ayuhu bhoga. Indeed, hlada is particularly insidious and especially perpetuates samsara, since it is the memories of pleasure that propel people to try to recreate and re-experience that pleasure, and thus get caught in the vicious cycle of karma that perpetuates samsara. Okay, just to remind you of the previous sutra, 2.14, te hlada paritapa phalaha punya punya hetutvat. These three things, the type of birth we get, our lifespan, and life experience, the kind of mix of pleasure and pain that we get in life, bear the fruits of pleasure and pain as a result of merit and demerit, punya and papa, or punya and apunya. Okay, so this explains the doctrine of karma, basically. And we do something good, something dharmika, something ethical or spiritual, and what happens? It generates good karma. And that's nice, right? But the point of the next sutra is partly, don't rest on your laurels and think that everything is hunky-dory if you do that, because the problem is you're still stuck in the cycle of samsara. You'll be forever trapped in this karmic cycle until you no longer crave either positive or negative karmic results from your actions. That's really important. So that doesn't mean don't be good and don't do good things. No. But if you do something good without desiring the karmic fruits, then that becomes a very powerful spiritual practice, and it helps you to break out of this cycle of karma. It can be exactly the same external action. It could be like working in a soup kitchen. And one person might be doing it for selfish reasons, like I want my name on that newspaper, or this is a CV builder so I can get into Harvard, or something else. In that case, it's barely even a good action. I mean, it's just kind of like a selfish action in disguise. Another attitude with which you could engage in the same action would be, I genuinely want to help the homeless and serve them, but I want to do so because I know that it's going to generate good karma for me, and I'm going to be happy in the future. And it doesn't sound like such a bad thing, and that's a good, and you'll get the good karma from doing it, either later in this life or in a future life. But you're still trapped in this karmic cycle. So the third attitude, this is the spiritual attitude. You do the same action externally, but the attitude is, I am serving the poor, serving the homeless, serving the needy, those who are less well off than I am, purely without any ulterior motive, without even wanting the good karma that comes from the action, but simply to serve. And or if you have a kind of theistic outlook, you can say, I am serving others in a spirit of worship by trying to see the divine in everyone. Now moving toward Vedanta, this is Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva. This is Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. So we move a little bit away from the Yoga Sutras here, but I'm just giving an example of a spiritual attitude, where if you do that and engage in the same action, then that's going to help break you out of this karmic cycle, this cycle of samsara. Okay, so that's the connection between 2.14 and 2.15. You have to recognize that even good karma is a bondage. Okay. The term, we'll skip the next paragraph. Okay, now, bottom of page 204, Bryant says, a better translation of dukkha than suffering might be, in my view, frustration. Since suffering often has physical connotations, and in addition to referring to physical pain, dukkha, perhaps even primarily, is the frustration that follows from the attempt to find permanent satisfaction in objects of the senses and mind that are, by their very nature, temporary. So this comes to this question of what is the best way to translate the term dukkha? And as I said, I think it has different shades of meaning. Suffering is one of them, but it also has connotations of things being fundamentally unsatisfying, unfulfilling or not ultimately fulfilling, not enough, not sufficient, right? Everything falling short, not being all that it's cracked up to be. All those connotations, I think, are contained in this term dukkha. There's a great line in Sri Aurobindo's epic English poem called Savitri, it's the beginning of one of his cantos. He says, all is too little that the world can give. All is too little that the world can give. That would be just another way to put this first noble truth of Buddhism and of yoga. All is too little that the world can give. Even if it's a very positive experience, it'll never be ultimately fulfilling or satisfying. Nothing in the world is. Okay, let me continue. This perception of the world as a place of frustration is fairly ubiquitous in the yogic traditions. The first noble truth of Buddhism, sarvam dukkham, all is suffering, consists of the exact same terms adopted by Patanjali. Coincidence? Probably not, because the Yoga Sutras was written after Buddhism, and it seems to have borrowed certain concepts from Buddhism. This is one of them. But we're going to see, actually, there's a more elaborate structure of the four noble truths in Buddhism have their counterparts in yoga philosophy, and the parallels are striking. They're not identical, the noble truths. Some of them are. Number one is, right? But then there starts to be deviations in 2 through 4, okay? And we'll talk about them in a second. So Bryant says, indeed, the other 3 noble truths are predicated upon the first, that there is a cause of this suffering. So he's talking about Buddhism now, that there is a cause of this suffering, that there is a possibility of putting an end to suffering, and that there is a path to accomplish the removal of suffering. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. Thus, the Buddhist path is based on a perception that the world, that is, the world as experienced under the influence of ignorance, is a place of suffering. Patanjali makes the same claim. Okay, this might be a good place to... Actually, no, let me read a little more and then I'll get to... Let me read one more little paragraph. This is on page 205. This sutra is actually the pivot of this chapter. 2.15, which in turn is the heart of the entire text of the whole Yoga Sutras, of all 4 books. Verses 2.1 through 14, the previous 14 sutras in Book 2, discuss the causes, the kleshas, so the afflictions, that produce dukkha. And verses 16 onwards, so the next sutra and following, focus on the path to remove dukkha as well as the state beyond. The chapter thus echoes the 4 noble truths. Okay, so I think this is a really helpful point. And now we can do a little comparison here. So let's first look at Buddhism. First noble truth, which is the same in yoga. Everything is unsatisfactory, unfulfilling. Okay, there's an exact match, identity. But now, the second noble truth of Buddhism is the cause of this unsatisfactoriness is thirst or craving. The Pali word is tanha, which comes from the Sanskrit term trishna. Trishna, which just means thirsty. This is not for a fluid, but thirsty for craving something to fill up that inner emptiness in you. That kind of thing. Any kind of worldly object or entity of any kind. Okay, anything external, outside of you, external to you. That's the first one. That's the second one. Okay. Now, by contrast, what does yoga philosophy say? According to yoga philosophy, the cause of suffering, it's not going to disagree. It's going to agree that thirst, desire, is at the basis of suffering, but it goes even deeper. And it gives a more, I would put it, metaphysical explanation of the ultimate cause of suffering. Buddha, I would say. I don't want to say Buddhist. Some Buddhists are extremely metaphysical, like the post-Buddha Buddhists, some of them, like Nagarjuna. But Buddha himself, he was a world teacher and extremely practical. And he gave this famous story. He says, somebody is struck by an arrow. Now, what is the rational thing to do for that person who's just been struck by an arrow? Is it like, who shot that arrow at me? And how dare he? Or I need help. I need to get treatment for this immediately. Let me try to remove the arrow as quickly as possible so I don't die. Well, if you remove the arrow, you're going to die quickly. Okay, fine. So that's a little flaw in my... Okay, but anyway. But remove it in a way that saves my life rather than kills me. How about that? Okay, all right. So Buddha says like that, instead of going into these abstruse, arcane, metaphysical disputes, discussions, inquiries into, what is my true nature, or does God exist, or this is that, try to remove that arrow of suffering, of samsara, of karma that's lodged in your chest, right? That should be your top priority. And so there's a kind of downplaying of the importance of metaphysical inquiry. That's a very typically Buddha-oriented kind of attitude. And with yoga, and you find this in Vedanta as well, they'll agree with the Buddha that you should be practical as a spiritual aspirant and that you shouldn't get caught up in metaphysical disputations and all that. But the deepest source of our suffering is ignorance. It's a mistaken understanding of the truth, basically, of who we are. We don't know what we really are. That's why we crave in the first place. So it's just giving a kind of deeper or more elemental explanation of the cause of all suffering. It says, yes, but this we agree with you. The cause of suffering is craving. And yet, that's not rock bottom. Because why do we crave things at all? You need to ask that. Because we have a mistaken understanding of what we are. We don't realize that we're already complete and that we're already fulfilled. So yoga philosophy says the cause of suffering is our mistaken identification with what they call prakriti, which means nature. But on the side of nature falls not only our physical body, but also our mind. And the vast majority of human beings mistakenly believe that they are this body-mind complex, this psychophysical complex. And it's because of that mistaken identification that the cravings that arise in the psychophysical complex are taken to be their own. I identify with my body-mind complex. In my mind arises a desire for a tiramisu. I immediately identify with that desire for a tiramisu. And there's no tiramisu handy now, which means I suffer. Right? If I didn't identify with my body-mind complex, it's completely irrelevant to me whether there's a desire for tiramisu or 100 other things, or if there are 100 aversions as well, because I know that I'm not that. It's just like, it's like watching two dogs fighting. You have no bone in that fight. Am I mixing metaphors? I don't even know. Okay, anyway. But the point is, you're just watching, and so you're not bothered. The dogs are furious with each other. They want to kill each other. But you're standing aside and watching the fun. So like that. Who cares what comes up in my mind? This is what Buddhists call the mindfulness practice, right? Take a step back from what's happening at the level of body-mind. They might still be there, but they lose their urgency, they lose their power, they lose their grip over you because you don't identify with those thoughts, and you thereby deprive those thoughts of their power and their hold on you, right? Okay, so the ultimate metaphysical cause of our suffering is ignorance. We ignorantly identify with the body-mind complex, and what are we ignorant of? Now we get to the third noble truth of yoga, but before let's start with Buddhism first. So, back to Buddhism. The third noble truth of Buddhism, the cessation of suffering is nirvana. How do we overcome all suffering? We have to get rid of craving. How do you get rid of craving? By attaining nirvana. There is a state called nirvana. It's a negative term because it literally just means extinguishing. typically of some kind of flame or light. Turn off the light. Okay, which sounds kind of bleak or dark, right? And some argue that it is, but actually even within Buddhism, there are different ways of interpreting nirvana, and some interpret it in a more positive way as a state of bliss and whatever. It gets complicated. But anyway, there is the possibility of ending all suffering if you attain the state of nirvana. And then you might think, well, that sounds too good to be true. And so then there's the fourth noble truth. Here's the method. The Noble Eightfold Path. And then it's got this whole list of practices, starting with Samyak Drishti, which means the right view, and then it goes into these right conduct and right mindfulness and all these things. Okay, now let's compare the third and fourth noble truths of Buddhism with the third and fourth noble truths of yoga philosophy. The third one is the cessation of suffering is had through the attainment of kaivalya, not nirvana, but kaivalya. Kaivalya literally means being alone, not lonely, but alone. And why is that the ideal of yoga philosophy? The idea is you have to realize that you are an eternal purusha, an eternal conscious self, immaterial self, non-physical self, completely separate from the body-mind complex, and completely unaffected by anything that happens at the level of the body or of the mind. The Purusha in reality has absolutely no connection with Prakriti. It's because of our delusion that we mistakenly identify with the body-mind complex, and then we suffer. But through different spiritual practices, we can gain knowledge of our true spiritual nature as an eternal conscious self, and then that instant will be liberated from all suffering. So what are those spiritual practices? Notice also this eightfold. So remember, eightfold path in Buddhism, this is the eight-limbed, Ashtanga yoga. In yoga philosophy, what is about to be taught in the subsequent sutras in book 2 is Ashtanga yoga. The eight-limbed yoga, which we're going to talk about in detail later, yama, niyama, asana, so there are a bunch of practices. Okay. So I think this is useful to keep in mind. You can take a picture of it if it helps you. In a nutshell, to capture the essence of yoga philosophy, and it shows how practical it is. The whole sutra, the whole text is oriented toward spiritual practice. It's a kind of spiritual manual. And Bryant points out that these 4 elements are also, you'll find the same thing in medical treatises at the time. There is a problem, a disease, right? You're not healthy for some reason. It could be, whatever it is, diabetes or cancer. And then number 2, the doctor needs to do a diagnosis, or not, after he does a diagnosis, that one is a diagnosis. What's the health condition? Number 2, what's the cause of your health condition? And often they make misdiagnoses and they mess it up. So you have to make sure that's right. What is the true cause? And you figure it out. Well, diabetes, it's type 2 diabetes. It's because of diet and lifestyle or whatever. Okay, so 3, cessation. So how do you get rid of, what's the cure for that disease? Well, removing the diabetes, right? For instance. And then, just saying that's not enough, well, how in the world do I remove my diabetes? Well, you got to exercise every day, you got to avoid sweets, and so on and so forth. Method, right? So in the same way, this follows the same kind of structure, except from a spiritual standpoint. So I think this is a really useful way of thinking about what the Yoga Sutra is teaching us. Okay, let's continue with this commentary. One might ask, without an experience of the world as frustrating on some level, what would motivate one to seek fulfillment elsewhere and take up the rigors and challenges of the yoga path? If one perceives the world of experience as a jolly fine place in which to be, why would one wish to seek a higher truth? From this perspective, a recognition of the world as a place of suffering is actually a preliminary realization for the path of yoga, or it might be argued, for any serious spiritual practice. Okay. I think this is a really important point to make, and I think part of what makes his commentary on this sutra so valuable is that it reads like he's also a spiritual aspirant, apart from being a scholar, Edwin Bryant. And there are some paragraphs which really do reflect his spiritual practice. So just think about it to yourself. How or what led you to, that's not a grammatical question. What led you to spiritual life in the first place? What was it? Was it a particular incident? Was it a number of years of living in a certain way and then realizing, well, wait a minute, there's something missing from my life and not living? Whatever it was. But at some level, I can guarantee you that there was a recognition of the things you were doing before you turned to spirituality as being, in some sense, unfulfilling or falling short in some way. That's all that this First Noble Truth means in both yoga and Buddhism, in all spiritual traditions. That's all that it means. When Jesus says the world is a vale of tears, he means the same thing. He's not being a Debbie Downer, but he's being realistic, right? Sri Ramakrishna would give the example. He says, imagine a baby happily sucking on its red pacifier. Sri Ramakrishna was a genius for the details. He didn't have to say red, but he did. It's a red pacifier, so remember that. Okay, red pacifier. And so long as it's happy with this pacifier, mother is in the kitchen preparing the meal. She'll occasionally glance over just to make sure he's not doing anything too crazy. I drove a car when I was, I think, 3 years old. Anyway, that's another story, don't get me. So it's just an example of better if I had my pacifier in my mouth. So anyway, okay, so pacifier, yes. Then, after some time, so when the baby suddenly starts, maybe not, it doesn't have to be sudden either. It could be that it's really enjoying this pacifier for a really long time, and then suddenly he's like, all right, enough is enough. And then you spit out the pacifier, and then what happens? The baby starts crying. Mommy, mommy, where are you? And then mother will come rushing toward the baby. But she's, as long as the baby is happy with the pacifier, mother is happy in the kitchen. Saying, oh, the baby doesn't need me. Baby's happy with the pacifier. So exactly like that, the vast majority of us, including so-called religious people, this is another thing. Swami Vivekananda would sometimes go on these polemical rants, not rant, that's too strong, polemical diatribes against, he hated hypocrisy more than anything else. This is the one thing he couldn't forgive. He'll forgive a lot of things, lapses, weaknesses, this, that, if you're honest with yourself about them. But people who dress in religious garb, who talk big about God and spirituality and do the opposite, that he couldn't tolerate. And he found that was rampant. And this is kind of true. I mean, you know, he says, what are the percentages? I always forget the percentages. I think it's something like in religious life and spiritual life, 80% turn out to be frauds or hypocrites. 15% go crazy, and 5% make it and attain the highest goal. So those are the odds. But the majority, it kind of like lends itself to hypocrisy in a way, because there's a kind of glamour and like people will praise you for being good and like, wow. And now it's very easy to become a YouTube guru. You just need your own channel and grow a beard. So you have to be very careful. Hypocrisy, where was I going with hypocrisy now? Oh my goodness. Wow. Pacifier, yeah. Okay, so there's a pacifier. I spit out the pacifier. I don't remember where I was going with it. I'm sorry about that. Mother comes back to the crying. There's a crying baby. I know. Sorry, I've completely lost my thread. But anyway, I'm sorry. I know, and I'm trying to figure out what led me to him not standing hypocrisy. Man. Mm-hmm.
So as long as the baby is satisfied with the pacifier,
yeah.
It's not meant for the mother. And once the satisfaction is
Mm-hmm. No, I get that. In my mind, there was a direct connection between that and this whole thing about hypocrisy, but yeah, no, man, sorry. Okay, it might come back to me. There was a good connection there. I just can't remember what it was. Think about it for yourself. It's an assignment. How about that? Yeah. Okay. So, A recognition of the world as a place of suffering is actually a preliminary realization for the path of yoga, or it might be argued for any serious spiritual practice. So another thing that Swamiji said, which is very powerful and which is really helpful, is he says, suffering is the great eye-opener. Suffering is the great eye-opener. And if you look back on your life and you ask yourself, what events in my life did I learn the most from? I bet, if you're honest with yourself, you'll say a lot of those moments were moments of suffering, apparent suffering, that retroactively you're grateful for. And you see them as a blessing. There's an example of somebody that some of you know, actually, last year. He doesn't mind my saying his name because he's an open fellow. Chris, who comes once in a while, and he stayed with us for a few weeks. We do this monk for a month thing, so he's here for a few weeks. And he's got one leg. He's an amputee. And it's because he drove a motorcycle when he was younger. And he was driving a motorcycle at, like, he said some insanely high speed, like over, I don't know, 110 or 120 miles an hour. And he gets into a really grisly accident. Doctors give him like a 3% chance to live. And it took him months or years to recover. And the wife left. I mean, it was really terrible. And it sounds terrible. And when he was here with us, and I just met him for the first time, I'm washing dishes and he's helping me. And he's so bright and positive and cheerful. And he brought it up on his own. And he just looked at me and he says, I'm so grateful for that. It changed my life. And I turned to spiritual life because of that accident. So it's a blessing in disguise. This is what Swami Tapasanji used to call viparita kripa. Suffering is God's grace in the form of what seems to be its opposite. That's the attitude that I think we should take toward all kinds of ordeals, challenges, suffering. There's a silver lining in all suffering. There's something to learn from it. All that suffering tells us is that something is out of alignment, that we need to bring ourselves back into alignment. So it's actually signaling to us that we need to change in some way, right? And when we do that, we change for the better. And that's why Swamiji would say, Swami Vivekananda would look back and he says, I don't feel guilty or ashamed about the bad things I've done. No, I'm grateful because they made me who I am now. I've grown through each of those experiences, right? So in that way, suffering being the great eye-opener. Okay, then he goes into Vyasa's explanation of why sense pleasures are ultimately so unsatisfying. This is the bottom of page 205. He says, Vyasa points out that the senses are never really freed from hankering by repeated indulgence, because such indulgence simply increases the attachment to pleasure as well as the demands of the senses. One remains even more dissatisfied than before. The Gita considers lust the eternal enemy, insatiable as fire. Mahashano, Mahapatma. Mahashano means it's all-devouring. It's never satisfied. The more fuel one pours on a fire, the stronger it burns. This is a well-known verse, which he'll quote in the next paragraph. Na jatu kamaha kamanam upavogena shamyati havisha krishnavatmeva bhuya eva vivardate, which means desire is never satisfied through enjoyment. Right? I have a desire for a tiramisu. I eat the tiramisu. That desire is momentarily satisfied. It's true. There is a brief moment when I'm satisfied. But then what happens? Once I'm hungry again, I'll want more tiramisu, right? And it won't always be available for me. And then I suffer. And even if I get it, it's not going to be quite as good as it was the first time, and so on and so forth, right? The law of diminishing returns. Okay. Therefore, indulgence is not the means to gain ultimate pleasure. And one who gets addicted to sense pleasure ends up immersed in dissatisfaction and, in this sense, enmeshed in frustration. This is the frustration born of consequences, parinama, the first type of suffering on Patanjali's list. Okay. And then, now with regard to tapa, the second reason for suffering, the suffering of pain. Tapa, the second type of suffering listed in the sutra, is identified by Vyasa as the three standard sources of suffering identified in traditional texts. And he explains the three. These are the standard three Sanskrit terms used. Adhyatmika, Adibhautika, and Adidaivika. Okay, let's go through them one by one. Adhyatmika. And by the way, when we do mantras and we say Om Shanti, 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 right? We say Shanti 3 times. Traditionally, those 3 Shantis, why the repetition? There's got to be some meaning to each of those Shantis. How are they different? So traditionally, each Shanti is a prayer for Shanti or peace at one of these 3 levels of being. Please let me attain peace at the Adhyatmika level, which is, so now coming back, I'll explain what the kinds of suffering are and then we'll link them back to the Shantis. So, Adhyatmika, suffering produced by one's own body and mind. So, because it means pertaining to suffering coming from your own self. So, such as illness, injury, insecurity, anxiety, so even mental, negative mental states also are created by yourself in a certain sense. Then second, Adibhautika, suffering produced by other beings, by other people. Other people can make your life hell. Jean-Paul Sartre, have you heard of him? The great French philosopher and novelist. He has this famous statement, hell is other people. Okay, it's not very pleasant. Okay, such as mosquitoes. Ooh, they're the worst. Bryant definitely has lived in India. Enemies, obnoxious neighbors. I like how specific these are. It's like Bryant is just having a field day with it. Even one's own, sometimes troublesome family members and loved ones. Okay. Okay, so that's the second one, Adibhautika suffering. And then the third one, Adidaivika, suffering produced by nature and the environment, such as storms or earthquakes. So we're hearing a lot about those kinds of natural disasters these days. Okay, so suffering produced by one's own body, mind, Adhyatmika. Suffering produced by other beings, Adibhautika. And suffering produced by nature and the environment, Adidaivika. When we say Om Shanti, 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 the first Shanti is, please let me find peace at the Adhyatmika level, at the level of body, mind. Second Shanti, oh Lord, please give me peace at the Adibhautika level, so that other beings can't affect my state of being, state of mind. That doesn't mean, you have to be careful here, because it's important in spiritual life as you evolve not to pray for selfish things. So you shouldn't be saying like, oh Lord, destroy all my enemies, or like punish those who don't like me, because those aren't very spiritual prayers, right? That's not the idea behind the second. But the idea is, oh Lord, give me the strength and the detachment not to be affected by what other people do or say about me or to me, right? That kind of strength and that kind of prayer. And then the third Shanti, Adidaivika. The third Shanti is, please give me Shanti at the level of nature and the environment. Again, that doesn't mean, make sure, oh Lord, that I never face any natural disasters and that my house will never get flooded and this and that. That becomes a little bit worldly again. It's not pleasant for anybody to have their house flooded and all that, obviously, but it's better to pray only for spiritual things. But the idea, again, is if, God forbid, something like that happens, give me the strength and spiritual wisdom to deal with it in the best possible way without being emotionally distraught, without becoming emotionally reactive, and so on and so forth, something like that. Okay, so remember, Vyasa's is the mainstream interpretation of Tapa here. And by contrast, so it's all the things that cause suffering in our life. That's obviously suffering, right? In a very obvious way. But Swamiji, remember, says anticipation of loss of happiness. And this is quite interesting. And I was thinking another example would be, let's imagine that I spend 30 years earning enough money to get some super fancy car that I've been wanting for a long time. Say like a really, really nice Rolls Royce or something. Now I get it. Now, what's the problem? It drives great, everything's cool. Now when I drive somewhere with it, and I have to drive somewhere with it because I want to impress people. If you keep it in the garage, nobody knows I have a really fancy Rolls Royce. So I'm driving it out, and I need to park. Okay, so I finally, with great difficulty, I find a parking spot. Now I get out, and now people are looking around. They're looking at the car, and now I'm paranoid. I'm paranoid about number one, could get stolen. It's a really nice car. What if somebody breaks in and steals the car? Even if it's not stolen, what if some punk takes a key and just keys my car? That's $10,000 in to remove that, because it's an expensive car. I have to go to the dealer. So I'm freaking out. And so like I'm spending half my time in anxiety. And then I go to that restaurant, but half my mind is on the car. So I'm looking outside the window all the time, worried that some kid's gonna come and key the car. Anxiety so even if you get something really, really good, the better it is, the more anxiety you may have about losing it. And I think that also falls under Swamiji's idea of tapa as anticipation of loss of happiness. So there can be, even in the midst of that present happiness, it's kind of infected with an anxiety, a worry, a suffering, a certain kind of poison lurking at the bottom of that cup. Okay. And let me read Bryant's explanation of samskaras. This is the third reason, the bottom of page 207. Samskaras, subliminal impressions, the next item mentioned by Patanjali as a source of suffering, are, as we know, the latent imprints deposited in the mind of every past experience of pleasure and suffering. When these ripen as karma and fructify, one again experiences pleasure and suffering. The desire for pleasure and aversion to pain trigger these latent samskaras, which fructify and become memories of past pleasures or pains. These memories generate fresh craving or aversion, the desire to recreate past pleasurable experiences or avoid known miseries. This is a form of mental torment or suffering. Okay, this is what I was explaining earlier, is that the moment I experience some pleasure, it creates a samskara, and then something in the future may trigger that samskara to reactivate, and then I'm going to have that same craving again. And unless it's satisfied, I'm going to become unhappy. Even if it's satisfied, the satisfaction of that desire again will produce more samskaras and becomes a vicious cycle. And I need more of that thing, that substance or that behavior to fulfill that desire. And I get caught in this cycle of addiction, basically. And these days, the problem is not just substance addictions, but also behavioral addictions. They're soaring now. So addiction to social media, this is especially rampant among teenagers. It's a huge problem. Pornography now, because it's ubiquitous and it's free, a lot of it. And it's literally at your fingertips. And so this is a kind of an unprecedented age of instant gratification, I think. And the temptations are massive and ubiquitous, and especially with young minds before they're fairly mature. They're born into iPads and smartphones and all of this. It's a terrifying situation for parents. I'm not one, and so I don't know. It's hard to even fathom what it's like to raise a kid under these circumstances. But it's hard. It's hard for everybody, but it's especially hard in this age, and we have to be extra mindful and careful. So, any questions? Yes, Ethan. Can you give the mic to Ethan?
Could you repeat that quote about suffering being a form of God's grace?
Yeah. So this is from a great book, which is kind of one of the less well-known books in our spiritual literature, in our tradition. Swami Vivekananda was a vice president of our order, and he's got this book, which is just a collection of his letters, his answers to questions posed by his disciples. I think he was a guru at the time, maybe not. But in any case, questions from spiritual aspirants and his answers. And the book is called Spiritual Quest. And somebody asked him about suffering. Why is it that God permits us to suffer? So it's the famous problem of evil and suffering, right, in philosophy and theology. And his answer is, the spiritual attitude is to approach suffering as viparita kripa. That's a Sanskrit term. I can write it down. Well, V-I-P-A-R-I-T-A, viparita kripa. Kripa means grace, God's grace, divine grace. And viparita means in the form of what seems to be its opposite. Yeah? So that, I think that a good example is the one of Chris, the guy who got in the motorcycle accident almost died, but it turns out that was one of the best things that ever happened to him in his life. Yeah, and so if you just each of our lives, we think about this one form of suffering that you're currently undergoing, and then explore this. How do I change my attitude such that I can see how God's grace is working through the suffering? What do I need to learn through the suffering that I'm missing? And once you get that, it completely changes your outlook on the whole, on that suffering. The suffering is no longer suffering. Yeah. And
one more, when I first read Tapa, my interpretation of it was kind of anxiety. Tapa being anxiety, but then when I look at Edwin's description through the Vyasas, that the first one being mind and body, that anxiety is but a symptom of Tapa. But I don't know if you could elaborate. The way that I almost see Tapa is that anticipation of loss of happiness, like worrying about something that hasn't happened yet or may not exist. And so I don't know if you have any more insight as far as that goes.
Well, I think that was partly where I was going with this example of the Rolls Royce, right? Is that even though you own this amazing machinery, which you've been wanting for a long time, and you're enjoying it in a certain sense, at the same time that the possession, the ownership of that item creates anxiety for you, right? And so I think an aspect of this anticipation of loss of happiness is anxiety, but anxiety is only one form that it can take, and there are many other forms. But again, even that anxiety, you can think about as signaling to you that something is out of alignment and that there's something to learn from it. So let me try to get to the root of the anxiety and address it at the root level. And when you do that, it's not just your anxiety that goes away, but you make spiritual progress. You just become a more fulfilled person in general, right? Yeah. Are there any online questions or... Can you check that quickly? And any other questions from people who are in the audience? Yeah, can you give the mic to Katyayani?
Can you get out of the suffering by that things are not permanent, by just the acceptance that things are temporal and that the loved ones that you have are going to pass away? Mm-hmm. But does that have to create more suffering? Can that make you more mindful in situations where you find yourself more in the moment with people you love and care about?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. There's another school of thought within, I was going to say Hinduism, but it's a little complicated because, what counts as a Hindu tradition? Charvaka. Does anyone know about Charvaka? You probably know about Charvaka. Yeah, some of you know about. So it's an ancient school of thought, which is basically a kind of hedonistic materialism of a certain sort. And the Charvaka scriptures, texts, whatever you want to call them, they don't believe in the Vedas. They say that the Vedas are the ravings of lunatics. So it's pretty harsh language. And it basically is the Indian equivalent of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So it's so the Charvaka people will say, you guys are right that these pleasures are impermanent. They're not going to last. But boy, are you freaking out and, making too big a deal out of it. When you accept the fact that things are temporary, you can actually enjoy them more. And you don't have to become this dour philosopher about it, and enjoy it while it lasts. And then when it's done, find another pleasure. And then, this is the Charvaka view. The problem is, if it's true to your experience, then great. Be a Charvaka, It's not. I'm not saying that yours is Charvaka, but the point is, there's a philosophy of life that says that just because something is impermanent doesn't mean that one shouldn't pursue it, right? Or something like that. But again, part of the reason why this sutra gives 4 different reasons for the suffering, and actually none of them are impermanence. Parinama, in a sense, has this impermanence built into it. I think all of these have impermanence somewhere lurking there. But there are so many other reasons. So I think each of us should just, we should ask ourselves, run the experiment and try it. But what these Indian spiritual traditions tell us is that it'll never be enough. no matter how much we try to find fulfillment in the momentary, it'll never be enough. We'll enjoy it while it lasts, but then once that thing is taken away, the loved one or the thing, what happens? I've seen some people who, when they lose their spouse of 50 years or 60 years, they literally can't live anymore. I mean, they just start dying within months, or they get dementia or something. You know, it's terrible, right? It's because of the emotional attachment, the comfort of being together for so long. It's a terrible pain to then to have that torn away from you. So it's better to deal with that attachment at the root level before you lose it. I don't know. Did that answer the question, or did I completely misunderstand what you were saying, or no? Okay. All right. Good. Other questions or comments? Anyone want to make the connection between hypocrisy and the thing? I'm still trying to. It's going on in my head. Anyway. Okay. Anything online? No? Okay, we got one question online.
How to watch the mind suffer without psychological self-abandoning?
Psychological self-abandonment. I don't know. Is that a technical term or something? Like a kind of disassociation or something? Is it? Huh?
How to watch the mind suffer without psychological self-abandoning?
Mm-hmm.
So self-abandonment from like a psychological perspective is basically like where you don't like validate your own experience.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think that question is sort of saying like how do you watch the mind without like spiritually bypassing it?
Mm-hmm. Without like accepting that you're going through a certain state or something.
Your own experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a good question. It's a deep question. It depends on, is it your experience at the end of the day? And so spiritual bypassing is a huge danger in spiritual life, and I think it's really important. And I think one of the dangers is we have some kind of serious problem in life. It could be a mental health issue, it could be some tragedy or something, and we're going through a lot. It's terrible. We're going through terrible suffering, and we turn to religion or spiritual life as a way of not having to think about that problem or that issue. It's a kind of escape into spiritual life. That's what's called spiritual bypassing. So in the case of this, like if there's some kind of negative thought or feeling, in spiritual practice, the idea is, depending on the practice, but let's say that you're practicing mindfulness toward that negative state or feeling, right? Spiritual bypassing is you're not even really acknowledging that the feeling is there, right? You're pretending that you're perfectly fine. Whereas the very fact that you're being mindful and honest with yourself about the fact that you actually you're acknowledging the fact that you have this negative feeling, this state, you're being non-judgmental about it. But you're saying it's there. I have this issue. And then you can take a step back from it. That's not spiritual bypassing. And I think that you are, that's a nice way to put it, is that I think you're honoring your experience because you're being honest about the fact that you have this unwholesome or negative state. You're not pretending it's not there. I think the spiritual bypassing comes in when the moment you turn to spiritual life, you pretend that everything is hunky-dory. And you are not sufficiently honest about what worldly problem it was or negative state of feeling or mental health issue led you to embrace spiritual life in the first place. It's an example I'm giving, right? But if you go in with your eyes open and you're honest about what's going on in your mind at the level of feeling, then I think that you'll be safe from spiritual bypassing. Yeah, got the idea.
I think like a way to check that too is if you're actually practicing mindfulness on something that's going on, some turbulence of the mind, to where you can just let it go, you won't think about it again. But if you're spiritually bypassing, there's going to be that like background.
It'll come back again.
Yeah.
Yeah, it won't go away, right? So if you practice mindfulness successfully, it'll lose its force, whatever that negative state or feeling is. But if you don't and you're bypassing, it's going to come back to haunt you. No matter how much you talk about spirituality now, come back to this hypocrisy stuff, right? But so being honest with yourself, that's really important at the end of the day. Okay, I think we should wrap it up. Next class, 2 weeks from now, Thursday, the 24th of July. See you guys. Thanks a lot. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.